Marcus Chen had always been a sucker for strays. His ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of New Geneva Colony sat like a beacon for every lost creature within 100 kilometers. Tonight was no different, except for the howling storm that battered his reinforced windows and made the atmospheric processors strain against the alien wind. The knock came just after midnight, barely audible over the tempest. Marcus pulled his thermal coat tighter and opened the heavy door to find a young woman collapsed on his doorstep. Her clothes were strange, made of materials that seemed to shift and shimmer in the porch light. More concerning were the burns across her arms and the way she trembled, not from cold but from something far deeper. "Please," she whispered, her accent unlike anything he'd heard in his 40 years of colony life. "I need shelter." Marcus didn't hesitate. He'd taken in injured miners, lost explorers, even a few smugglers over the years. This was just another soul in need. He helped her inside, noting how her skin seemed almost too warm, how her eyes held flecks of gold that caught the firelight in impossible ways. "What's your name?" he asked, settling her on the old couch near his stone fireplace. "Lyra," she said simply, watching the flames with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. "I am between places." The storm raged for 3 days. Lyra slept mostly, curled near the fire like a cat seeking warmth. When she was awake, she spoke little but observed everything. Marcus noticed she never seemed to eat the food he offered, though she accepted water gratefully. Her injuries healed with remarkable speed, the burns fading to nothing within hours. On the 4th morning, Marcus woke to find another visitor. This one was a massive creature, easily twice the size of any wolf, with silver fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It lay sprawled across his kitchen floor, breathing heavily, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Another stray," Marcus muttered, already reaching for his veterinary supplies. The colony had taught him basic medical care for both humans and animals out of necessity. The wolf thing's eyes opened as Marcus approached, and he saw intelligence there that stopped him cold. Not animal cunning, but something deeper, more aware. The creature watched him for a long moment, then lowered its massive head in what could only be interpreted as submission. "All right, big fellow," Marcus said softly. "Let's see what we can do about that leg." Lyra appeared in the doorway as Marcus worked, her face pale but unsurprised. "He followed me," she said simply. "I should have known." "Friend of yours?" Marcus asked, carefully setting the splint. The creature's bone structure was unlike anything in the colony's xenobiology database, but the principle remained the same. You could say that. Lyra knelt beside the injured animal, placing her hand on its head. For just a moment, Marcus thought he saw something pass between them, a flicker of communication that had nothing to do with words. The wolf thing stayed. Marcus named him Shadow for obvious reasons, and within a week, the creature was following him around the property like an oversized dog. The broken leg healed even faster than Lyra's burns had, and soon Shadow was hunting the local wildlife with an efficiency that impressed even the experienced colonist. 2 weeks later, the third arrival changed everything. Marcus had been repairing his atmospheric processor when the sky darkened. Not storm clouds, but something else entirely. A ship descended through the atmosphere, its hull black as space and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. It landed in his front yard with the whisper-quiet precision of advanced technology. The beings that emerged were tall, elegant, and clearly not human. Their skin had a crystalline quality, and their movements spoke of predatory grace. They wore armor that seemed to be grown rather than manufactured, and their weapons hummed with barely contained energy. Human. Their leader spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache. "You harbor criminals. Surrender them and your death will be swift." Marcus looked back at his cabin where Lyra and Shadow waited. The young woman stood in the doorway, her face resigned but determined. Shadow crouched beside her, no longer the injured creature Marcus had saved, but something far more dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, stepping between the aliens and his home. "These are guests. Under colony law and human custom, they're under my protection." The alien leader made a sound that might have been laughter. "Protection? You are one aging human on a backwater world. We are the hegemony's finest hunters. Step aside." Marcus had faced claim jumpers, corporate raiders, and the harsh realities of frontier life for decades. He'd learned that sometimes you had to make a stand, even when the odds were impossible. He raised his plasma rifle, an old mining tool converted for protection, and smiled grimly. Then I guess you'll have to go through me. Behind him, he heard Lyra whisper something in a language that made the very air shimmer. Shadow's growl deepened to a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The temperature around the fireplace began to rise, and Marcus realized with growing amazement that his strays might not be as helpless as they appeared. The lead hunter raised its weapon, energy crackling along its length. So be it, human. Your loyalty is admirable but futile. As the first shot rang out, Marcus dove for cover, wondering if his natural inclination to help the lost and injured had finally gotten him killed. Behind him, the cabin erupted in light and heat that had nothing to do with his humble fireplace, and he began to understand that he might have been sheltering far more than just a couple of strays. The world exploded into chaos around Marcus as he dove behind his workshop's metal walls. The hunter's weapons sent streams of superheated plasma over his head, melting through his equipment like butter. But the return fire from his cabin was something else entirely. Lyra stepped out of the doorway and Marcus saw her true form for the first time. Her human appearance flickered like a broken hologram, revealing something magnificent and terrible. Her skin had become scales that shifted between gold and crimson. Her eyes blazed with inner fire, and when she opened her mouth to speak, flames danced between her teeth. You dare hunt me on a world under human protection? Her voice had changed too, carrying harmonics that made the very ground tremble. You forget yourselves, hegemony dogs. The lead hunter stumbled backward, its crystalline features shifting to what Marcus assumed was surprise. Impossible. The scans showed you were weakened, near death. You should not have this much power. Shadow had undergone his own transformation. No longer merely wolf-like, he had grown to the size of a small transport vehicle. His silver fur rippled with energy, and his eyes burned with the same fire as Lyra's. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder. She rests beside the hearth of one who shows kindness to strangers. Shadow rumbled. Do you know nothing of the old laws, Hunter? She draws strength from his generosity, power from his compassion. Marcus pressed himself against the workshop wall, trying to process what he was seeing. The plasma fire continued to streak back and forth across his property, but now it seemed almost ritualistic, like the opening moves of some cosmic chess game. One of the hunters called out in their crystalline language, and the leader responded sharply. Marcus's universal translator struggled with the rapid exchange, catching only fragments about ancient treaties and protected status. This changes nothing, the leader finally declared in Standard Galactic. The Dragon Queen is a war criminal. Her companion is bound to her crimes. They will face hegemony justice. Lyra laughed, and the sound was like controlled wildfire. Dragon Queen? Is that what they call me now? How quaint. She raised one hand, and Marcus watched in fascination as the air around her fingers began to warp with heat. I am Valdris, Flame of the Seventh Realm, Keeper of the Solar Winds. Your hegemony is barely 1,000 years old. I was ancient when your species first looked to the stars. The tactical situation was becoming clearer to Marcus, even through his shock. These hunters had come expecting to capture a weakened fugitive. Instead, they'd found something far more dangerous, something that was drawing power from an unexpected source. The human doesn't understand what he harbors, the lead hunter said, raising its weapon toward Marcus. We will remove the complication. That was a mistake. Shadow moved faster than anything that large had a right to, placing himself between Marcus and the hunters. The plasma bolt that would have killed the colonist instead struck the great wolf's shoulder, and his howl of pain shook the cabin's windows. Valdris went very still. The playful flames dancing around her hands died, replaced by something far more dangerous. The temperature around the cabin spiked so rapidly that Marcus felt his eyebrows singe. You harmed my packmate, she said quietly. You threatened my host. Each word fell like a hammer blow. Now you will learn why the hegemony fears the old powers. She rose into the air without visible means of support, her transformed body becoming something from legend. Wings of pure fire unfurled from her shoulders, and her dragon form became fully manifest. She was beautiful and terrible, a creature of scales and flame that belonged in ancient myths, not on a backwater colony world. The hunters opened fire with everything they had, but their weapons seemed pitiful against her transformed state. She moved through their plasma streams like they were gentle rain, her scales deflecting energy that could have leveled buildings. Marcus watched in awe as she descended upon them. She didn't kill them outright, he noticed. Instead, she disabled their weapons with surgical precision, melted their armor in strategic places, and generally made it clear that their lives continued only because she allowed it. "You will leave," she commanded, landing among them. "You will report that the quarry has vanished beyond your reach. You will forget this world exists." The lead hunter struggled to its feet, its crystalline features cracked from the heat. "The hegemony will not forget this insult. We will return with a fleet." Valdris tilted her great head, and Marcus thought he saw something like pity in her blazing eyes. "Will you?" "Look around you, Hunter. What do you see?" For the first time, the aliens seemed to truly observe their surroundings. Marcus followed their gaze and felt his own shock. His humble property, his simple cabin and workshop, sat in the middle of what could only be described as a garden of impossible beauty. Plants that hadn't been there an hour ago swayed in breezes that carried the scent of distant worlds. The very ground seemed richer, more alive. "This is a sanctuary world," Shadow said, limping over to press against Marcus's side. His wound was already healing, closing with the same impossible speed Valdris had shown. "Your host's kindness has awakened powers that sleep in all generous hearts. The old laws recognize this place as neutral ground." The hunters exchanged glances that Marcus didn't need to translate. They were realizing that they'd stumbled into something far beyond their mission parameters. "The Galactic Accords," the leader whispered. "Article 7. Sanctuary worlds cannot be violated by military action." "Very good," Valdris said, settling back into her human appearance with casual grace. "Your education was not entirely wasted. Now leave and remember that some laws are older than empires." As the hunters retreated to their ship, Marcus found his voice. "What just happened here?" Valdris turned to him, and her smile was warm despite the fire that still flickered in her eyes. "You did what you always do, Marcus Chen. You helped those who needed it." The universe noticed. The alien ship lifted off with undignified haste, disappearing into the darkening sky. Marcus stood in his transformed yard looking at the woman who was and wasn't human, and the wolf who was clearly much more than he appeared. "I think," he said slowly, "you two have some explaining to do." Marcus sat by his fireplace nursing a cup of coffee that tasted better than any he'd ever made. Everything in his cabin seemed enhanced somehow, from the warmth of the flames to the comfort of his old furniture. Valdris and Shadow sat across from him, both back in their human and wolf forms, though now he could see hints of their true nature in the way firelight played across their features. "So," Marcus said, setting down his cup. "Dragon Queen?" Valdris smiled ruefully. "That's a human translation. In my people's language, it would be closer to she who commands the solar winds or keeper of the starfire. But yes, I suppose Dragon Queen works. And you're a war criminal?" Shadow snorted, a sound that held too much intelligence for any normal wolf. "She's a war criminal the way your George Washington was a terrorist. It depends entirely on which side writes the history." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You know Earth history?" "I know many things," Shadow replied. "I am what your people might call a familiar spirit, though that term carries unfortunate connotations. I am bound to Valdris by choice in ancient compact. Where she goes, I follow." Valdris leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the firelight with that disturbing intensity. "The hegemony calls me a criminal because I refuse to let them strip mine my people's sacred worlds. Because I fought back when they decided our ancient treaties were inconvenient. Because I would not bow to their expansion. How long have you been running?" "Time moves differently for my kind," she said softly. "By your reckoning, perhaps 50 years. I've been wounded, weakened by constant pursuit. My power was nearly exhausted when I found your world." Marcus thought about the young woman who had collapsed on his doorstep, burning with fever and barely able to stand. "You were dying." "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I had given up. I came to your world because it was remote, forgotten. I thought to find a quiet place to fade away. But you didn't fade." Shadow's tail thumped against the floor. "That's where you come in, Marcus Chen. You did something the hegemony never expected, something that changed everything. I gave her a place by the fire. More than that," Valdris said. "You showed kindness to a stranger without expectation of reward. You took in the injured without asking their history. In doing so, you awakened something that has slept in this world since its formation." Marcus gestured at the window, where his transformed property stretched out under alien stars. "This sanctuary business? Every world has the potential," Shadow explained. But it requires a catalyst, someone whose generosity is pure enough to wake the sleeping consciousness of the planet itself. It's extraordinarily rare. How rare? Valdris smiled. In all the galaxy, there are perhaps 12 true sanctuary worlds. Now there are 13. Marcus absorbed this, taking another sip of his impossibly perfect coffee. So what happens now? Those hunters won't just give up. Actually, they will, Valdris said. Sanctuary world status is protected by treaties older than the hegemony. Even they don't dare violate those accords. But that's not the real question, Shadow added, fixing Marcus with his too intelligent gaze. The real question is what you want to do with what you've awakened. Before Marcus could ask what he meant, his communication console chimed. The display showed an incoming message with transmission codes he didn't recognize, broadcasting on frequencies that should have been impossible to reach his simple equipment. Marcus Chen of New Geneva Colony. The voice that emerged was melodious. Clearly non-human but speaking perfect standard galactic. We are the Eternal Court. We request permission to establish diplomatic contact. Marcus looked at his guests. Friends of yours? The Eternal Court represents the old powers, Valdris explained. Those who remember the time before the hegemony's expansion. They've been hidden, scattered, barely surviving. But a new sanctuary world changes everything, another chime. This time the transmission bore the crystalline harmonics of the hunters who had just left. Sanctuary world designation confirmed. Hegemony forces withdrawing to treaty-mandated distance. We apologize for the misunderstanding, then another, and another. Within minutes, Marcus's humble communication array was receiving messages from across the galaxy. Trade offers, diplomatic overtures, request for asylum, pleas for help. Every power in the galaxy will want to establish relations with the sanctuary world, Shadow explained. You've become the most important human in the galaxy, whether you wanted to or not. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at his transformed property. The impossible plant swayed in breezes that carried the scent of worlds he'd never seen. In the distance, he could see lights moving through his woods. Not the harsh glare of technology, but the soft glow of life itself awakening. I didn't ask for this. The best leaders never do, Valdris said gently. But you have a choice, Marcus. You can embrace what you've become, or you can try to return to your simple life. Can I? Return to simple, I mean. Shadow and Valdris exchanged a look. The sanctuary status cannot be revoked, Shadow said carefully. Your world will remain a place of refuge. But you personally could step back. Let others handle the politics and diplomacy. Marcus thought about the young woman who had collapsed on his doorstep, about the injured wolf who had trusted him enough to submit to treatment, about 40 years of taking in strays and lost souls because it was the right thing to do. What would happen to people who need help? The ones running from the hegemony or whoever else is out there? Without a human advocate, someone who understands both your people's laws and the galactic situation, many would be turned away, Valdris admitted. Sanctuary worlds require guides, translators between the old powers and the new. Another chime from his console. This message was from the Colonial Authority, using emergency frequencies. Marcus Chen, we're receiving reports of massive energy signatures from your location. Colonial Defense Force en route. Please respond. Marcus smiled, recognizing the panic in their bureaucratic language. His little backwater colony was about to become the center of galactic attention, and the paper pushers in orbit were terrified. Shadow, he said, how good are you at explaining complicated situations to nervous officials? I have some experience. And Valdris, think you can handle playing ambassador to a bunch of frightened humans? She grinned, and for a moment fire danced behind her teeth. It might be entertaining. Marcus turned back to his communication console where messages continued to stream in from across the galaxy. Well then, he said, settling into his chair, I guess we'd better get to work. Can't have all these strays thinking they're not welcome. As he reached for the transmit control, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For the first time since his wife had died and left him alone on this frontier world, he had a reason to look forward to tomorrow, even if tomorrow was going to be considerably more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The Colonial Defense Force arrived 6 hours later, their 3 patrol ships descending through atmosphere like angry hornets. Marcus watched from his porch as they circled his property, their scanners working overtime to make sense of readings that probably had their instruments screaming warnings. Remarkable restraint, Shadow observed. Sprawled across the porch steps in his wolf form. They haven't opened fire yet. Give them time, Valdris replied, sipping tea that steamed with more than just heat. Fear makes people do foolish things. Marcus activated his external communicator as the lead ship finally landed at what the pilot clearly thought was a safe distance. This is Marcus Chen. You gentlemen seem a bit nervous. Marcus, this is Colonel Rodriguez from Orbital Command. The voice carried the strain of someone dealing with a situation far beyond their training. We're reading massive energy signatures from your location, along with what our computers insist are impossible atmospheric and geological changes. Are you under duress? Not exactly under duress, no. Though I am hosting some refugees who've had a rough time lately. Refugees from where? We have no record of any ships entering this system. Marcus glanced at Valdris, who nodded encouragingly. It's complicated, Colonel. Why don't you come up to the house? We've got coffee, and I suspect you're going to need it. An hour later, Colonel Rodriguez sat in Marcus's living room, staring at his coffee cup with the expression of a man reconsidering his career choices. His aide, Lieutenant Kim, hadn't spoken since Valdris had casually demonstrated her ability to make fire dance in her palm. So, Rodriguez said slowly, you're telling me that your acts of kindness toward refugees have somehow transformed your homestead into a galactically recognized sanctuary world? That's about the size of it, Marcus confirmed, though I'm still figuring out what that means myself. And she, Rodriguez pointed at Valdris without looking directly at her, is actually a dragon who's been fighting a war across the galaxy. Dragon Queen, Shadow corrected from his position by the fire. The distinction matters in diplomatic circles. Rodriguez nearly dropped his cup. The wolf talks. Many things talk, Colonel, Shadow replied mildly. You simply haven't been listening to the right languages. Lieutenant Kim finally found her voice. Sir, the communication traffic we've been monitoring. There are ships approaching from all over the galaxy. Dozens of them. Our sensors can't identify half the signatures. They're coming for the sanctuary, Valdris explained. Word spreads quickly when a new neutral ground emerges. Those who have been hiding, fighting, running for their lives, they'll come seeking refuge. And they all want to land here? Rodriguez asked. Some will, Marcus said. Others will want to establish embassies, trade relationships, or just make contact with a world where they know they're safe to talk. This is way above my pay grade, Rodriguez muttered. I need to contact Earth government. That might take a while, Lieutenant Kim said, consulting her tablet. Fastest transmission time to Earth is still 18 months one way. Then we improvise, Rodriguez said. Marcus, I need to ask you directly. Are you still a citizen of the Colonial Authority? Marcus considered this. Far as I know. I pay my taxes, file my mineral reports, follow colonial law. Why? Because technically this makes you our first point of contact with these galactic powers. Which means congratulations, you're now our unofficial ambassador to everyone. Shadow made a sound that might have been laughter. Unofficial ambassadors often accomplish more than official ones. They're less constrained by protocol. Speaking of protocol, Valdris said, rising gracefully, we have visitors. Through the window, Marcus could see lights descending from orbit. Not the harsh glare of human spacecraft, but something softer, more organic. The ship that landed resembled a seed pod more than anything built in a factory, its hull shifting between green and gold as it settled into his front yard. The Eternal Court, Valdris said. I recognize their bioships. They're among the oldest spacefaring species in the galaxy. The beings that emerged looked like they belonged in an ancient forest, tall, graceful, with bark-like skin and eyes that reflected starlight. They moved with the careful dignity of trees swaying in a gentle breeze. Marcus Chen of New Geneva, their leader, spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that reminded him of wind through leaves. I am Grove Singer Aelin of the Eternal Court. We come seeking sanctuary and offering friendship. Rodriguez stood, his military bearing asserting itself. I am Colonel Rodriguez, representing the colonial authority of this system. Any diplomatic contact should go through proper channels. Aelin turned those ancient eyes toward the colonel. With respect, human soldier, the laws we honor predate your species' first steps beyond your birth world. We speak to the sanctuary keeper directly. The what now? Marcus asked. You, Valdris said softly. That's your title, Marcus. You're not just the owner of a sanctuary world. You're its keeper, its protector and judge. More lights appeared in the sky, ships of designs Marcus had never seen. some clearly technological, others that seemed grown rather than built. His quiet homestead was becoming the busiest spaceport in the sector. "This is happening too fast," Rodriguez said. "We need protocols, procedures, security arrangements." "Colony security forces won't be much use against most of what's coming," Shadow observed. The hegemony hunters were barely a threat to Valdris, and they're among the most feared military units in the galaxy. "Then what do we do?" Marcus looked around his living room at the colonel's worried face, at Valdris's calm confidence, at the ancient being waiting patiently on his porch. He thought about all the strays he'd taken in over the years, all the lost souls who'd found their way to his door. "We do what we've always done," he said. "We help those who need it, we treat everyone with respect, and we figure out the rest as we go." "That's not a diplomatic strategy," Rodriguez protested. "No," Aylin said, having apparently listened through the window. "It is something far rarer and more valuable. It is wisdom." Another ship landed, this one clearly built rather than grown, its hull scarred by weapons fire and patched with a dozen different materials. The airlock opened to reveal a group of humanoid beings with translucent skin and multiple arms, their clothing marking them as laborers or refugees. The hegemony's former slaves, Valdris identified. Word really is spreading quickly. Marcus stood, straightening his work clothes and running a hand through his graying hair. "Colonel, I appreciate the colonial authorities' position, but these people need help now. We can work out the paperwork later." "Marcus, that's Sanctuary Keeper Chen," he said with a slight smile, "and my first official act is to declare this world open to all who come in peace." He walked to his door, where more beings were gathering in his transformed yard. Creatures of crystal and flame, organic ships that pulsed with bioluminescent light and others that defied easy description. All of them looked at him with a mixture of hope and desperate need. "Welcome to New Geneva," he called out. "I'm Marcus, and this is Sanctuary Ground. If you're here for shelter, you're welcome. If you're here for trouble, you won't like what you find." Behind him, he heard Rodriguez muttering into his communicator about protocols and chain of command. But Marcus had more immediate concerns. His property was about to become a refugee camp, diplomatic center, and cultural exchange all rolled into one. He was going to need more coffee. A lot more coffee. 3 weeks later, Marcus's simple homestead had transformed into something that would have been impossible to imagine. His property now stretched far beyond its original boundaries, the sanctuary field expanding to accommodate the growing population of refugees, diplomats, and curious visitors from across the galaxy. The impossible thing was that it all worked. Beings who had been enemies for millennia shared the same spaces, bound by the sanctuary laws that seemed to right themselves as needed. The hegemony's former slaves worked alongside traders from the Eternal Court. Crystal beings from the Shattered Realms played games with refugee children who breathed methane instead of oxygen. Marcus sat on his expanded porch, watching a group of quadrupedal engineers work with human colonists to build housing that could accommodate a dozen different atmospheric requirements. The site would have been chaos anywhere else, but here it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "You're brooding again," Valdris observed, settling into the chair beside him. She'd taken to wearing human clothes most of the time, though she couldn't quite hide the way heat waves danced around her when she was thinking. "Not brooding," Marcus corrected, processing. 2 days ago, I mediated a dispute between a hive mind collective and a species that communicates through music. Yesterday, I had to explain to the colonial authority why we needed to expand the no-fly zone around the planet. Today I get to figure out why the hegemony wants to establish a trade office here. Shadow padded up the porch steps, his wolf form somehow managing to look smug. That would be because 3 of their member species have already defected and requested asylum here. They're trying to minimize the embarrassment. Marcus rubbed his temples. Ambassador Keth seemed nervous about something. More nervous than usual, I mean. "He should be," Valdris said darkly. "The hegemony's expansion has stalled completely since your sanctuary declaration. Other worlds are starting to declare independence, knowing they have a place to retreat to if things go badly." "And that's my fault?" "That's your achievement," corrected a new voice. Grove singer Aylin approached the porch, his bark-like skin shifting to deeper browns as he walked. Over the past weeks, Marcus had learned to read the Eternal Court members' emotional states through these color changes. Deep brown meant serious concern. What's wrong, old friend? We have received troubling intelligence from our deep scouts, Aelin said, settling onto the porch with the careful grace of his people. The Hegemony High Command is debating more direct action. Shadow's ears flattened. They wouldn't dare. Sanctuary violation would bring the entire Galactic Council down on them. The Galactic Council has been toothless for centuries, Valdris reminded him, and desperate beings do desperate things. Marcus felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. It was the same feeling he'd had during claim disputes in the early days of the colony, when he'd had to choose between his safety and doing what was right. What kind of direct action? Economic pressure initially, Aelin explained. Cutting off trade routes, declaring this system a hazard to navigation. If that fails, he paused, his skin darkening further, there are precedents. Artificial disasters that provide cover for military intervention. They'd destroy an entire world to stop a sanctuary? They've done it before, Valdris said quietly. Not often and always with careful political cover, but yes, the hegemony didn't conquer half the galaxy by respecting inconvenient laws. Marcus looked out over his transformed property, where hundreds of beings from dozens of species had found safety and hope. Children played games that combined the rules of a dozen different worlds. Artists created works that blended technologies and aesthetics in ways that had never been possible before. Scientists shared knowledge that had been hoarded or lost for centuries. How long do we have? Unknown, Aelin admitted. But the High Command meets in one standard month to finalize their response to the New Geneva crisis, as they're calling it. And if they decide to move against us? Your Colonial Defense Force has 3 patrol ships and a couple of armed shuttles, Shadow said bluntly. Admirable spirit, but they wouldn't last 5 minutes against a hegemony battle group. However, Valdris added, fire flickering briefly in her eyes, they wouldn't just be fighting the Colonial Defense Force. Marcus looked at her sharply. Valdris, you said yourself you were weakened when you came here. That was 3 weeks ago, she smiled. Before I spent every night sleeping beside a fireplace built by generous hands. Before I shared meals with beings who showed kindness to strangers. Before I watched the daily miracle of sanctuary law at work. She stood, and for a moment her human disguise flickered, revealing glimpses of scales and flame. I am far from weak now, Marcus Chen. And she's not the only power that has been restored by this place, Aelin added. The Eternal Court has awakened abilities we thought lost forever. The refugees you've sheltered include warriors and defenders from 100 worlds. Even the former slaves have remembered skills the hegemony tried to suppress. Marcus absorbed this, watching a group of crystal beings teach human children how to sing light into existence, so we could fight them. We could try, Shadow said. But that's not the question you should be asking. What should I be asking? Whether you want this sanctuary to become a fortress. Marcus understood immediately. The moment they prepared for war, the sanctuary would change. Fear would replace hope. Weapons would share space with children's laughter. The dream of a place where anyone could find peace would die, even if they won the battle. There has to be another way. There is, Valdris said softly. But you're not going to like it. Tell me. You invoke the right of challenge. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Marcus had been learning galactic law and custom, but this was new to him. Explain. Ancient law, Aelin said reluctantly. Older than the hegemony, older than most current governments. When a sanctuary world is threatened, its keeper can challenge the threatening power to single combat. If the keeper wins, the sanctuary is protected by treaty. If the keeper loses, the sanctuary protection is forfeit, Shadow finished. The world becomes just another conquest. Marcus stared out at the impossible beauty his kindness had created. Who would I fight? The hegemony's greatest champion, Valdris said. Likely High Marshal Kraid himself. He's never lost a challenge combat. And he's not exactly human-sized, Shadow added helpfully. Think 2 meters tall, 4 arms, skin that deflects most energy weapons, and a personal shield system that's never been breached. Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching a group of refugee children from 6 different species learn to play an Earth game called soccer. They'd had to modify the rules to accommodate different numbers of limbs and movement capabilities, but their laughter was universal. How long before I have to decide? The formal challenge can only be issued after they make their intentions clear, Aelin explained. Once they announce their intent to move against the sanctuary, you have 72 standard hours to invoke the right. And if I don't challenge them? Then we fight a war we'll probably lose, Valdris said simply. And even if we win, the sanctuary dies in the process. Marcus stood, his decision already forming. He'd spent 40 years learning that sometimes the only way to protect what mattered was to put yourself at risk. He'd done it for claim jumpers, for lost miners, for anyone who needed help. Then I guess I better start training. Marcus, Shadow said urgently, Kraid has been fighting wars since before your species reached the stars. You can't possibly— Maybe not, Marcus interrupted, but I can try, and sometimes trying is enough. As if summoned by his words, a new ship appeared on the horizon, larger than any that had come before. Its hull bore the mixed symbols of the Galactic Council, a group Marcus had thought was merely ceremonial. The Council, Aelin breathed. They're actually responding. The ship settled in the field beyond Marcus's property, and a delegation emerged that represented some of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy. At their head walked a figure in robes that seemed to contain starlight. Marcus Chen, Sanctuary Keeper, the figure called out in a voice that carried across the distance without effort. We are the High Council, and we come with an offer that may change everything. The High Council's delegation was unlike anything Marcus had seen, even after weeks of hosting beings from across the galaxy. The leader, who had introduced herself as Prime Counselor Zarathi, seemed to be made of living starlight contained within translucent robes. Around her, representatives from the galaxy's oldest civilizations stood in a semicircle that spoke of both ceremony and power. They met in what had once been Marcus's simple living room, but had somehow expanded to accommodate beings of various sizes and atmospheric needs. The sanctuary's strange magic ensured everyone could breathe, communicate, and exist comfortably in the same space. Sanctuary Keeper Chen, Prime Counselor Zarathi began, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. We come to discuss the crisis approaching your world. I'm listening, Marcus replied, settling back into his favorite chair. After weeks of diplomatic meetings, he'd learned that appearing relaxed often put his visitors at ease. The hegemony has indeed voted to take action against this sanctuary, said another council member, this one resembling a crystalline tree with geometric leaves. Their high command has authorized economic sanctions, navigation hazards, and if necessary, direct military intervention. We know, Shadow said from his place by the fire. The question is what you intend to do about it. A third counselor, whose species Marcus couldn't identify beyond vaguely aquatic, gestured with what might have been fins. The Galactic Council has been powerless for too long. We have allowed the hegemony to expand unchecked, to break ancient treaties, to suppress the rights of countless worlds. But a sanctuary world changes the equation, Zarathi continued. For the first time in centuries, we have a rallying point, a place where the old laws still hold power. Valdris leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. You want to use Marcus's sanctuary as a symbol for resistance to the hegemony? More than a symbol, the crystalline counselor replied. A foundation. If we can demonstrate that the ancient protections still have power, that there are still places where the hegemony's authority means nothing, other worlds will follow. Marcus felt that familiar weight settling on his shoulders again. You're talking about galactic war. We're talking about freedom, the aquatic counselor said passionately. The hegemony has crushed or absorbed thousands of civilizations. They strip mine sacred worlds, enslave entire populations, and rewrite history to suit their narrative. Someone has to stand against them. But why here? Marcus asked. Why now? Zarathi's starlight form seemed to pulse brighter. Because you, Marcus Chen, have done something extraordinary. You've proven that the ancient laws still respond to genuine compassion. You've created something the galaxy thought was lost forever. And because, added Grove Singer Aelin from where he sat with the refugee representatives, the alternative is the slow death of everything that makes civilization worth preserving. Marcus looked around the room at the faces watching him. Refugees who had found hope. Ancient species who had hidden for centuries. His own people, represented by a very uncomfortable Colonel Rodriguez, who had been trying to explain the situation to his superiors for weeks. What exactly are you proposing? A formal alliance, Zarathi said. The council backing your sanctuary with our full authority. In return, you allow us to establish a permanent presence here, and you agree to serve as the council's representative in dealing with the hegemony crisis. That sounds like a fancy way of saying I become a target. You're already a target, Valdris pointed out. The question is whether you face the hegemony alone or with the combined power of the council behind you. Shadow's ears perked up. There's something else. I can smell it on them. What aren't you saying? The counselors exchanged glances that didn't require translation in any language. Finally, Zarathi spoke. The hegemony has already begun moving military assets toward this system. Our intelligence suggests they plan to arrive within 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Rodriguez finally found his voice. That's not enough time to mount any kind of defense. Actually, said the crystalline counselor, it might be exactly enough time. For what? To invoke the convergence. Marcus had never heard the term, but he saw the effect it had on the others. Valdris sat up straighter, fire flickering behind her eyes. Shadow's hackles rose. Even Aylin's bark skin shifted to colors Marcus had never seen before. The convergence was dissolved millennia ago, Valdris said. After the Third Galactic War, the surviving members swore it would never be invoked again. Desperate times, Zarathi replied. The convergence protocols still exist. If a sanctuary world is threatened with destruction, and if the council votes unanimously, the ancient alliances can be reactivated. What does that mean in practical terms? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Every species that ever signed the original Convergence Pact would be bound to defend this world, the aquatic counselor explained. Fleets that have been hidden for centuries would emerge. Powers that the hegemony doesn't even know exist would suddenly appear on the battlefield. It would be the largest space battle in galactic history, Shadow said quietly. The final confrontation between the old powers and the new. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at his transformed property. Children from a dozen species played in gardens that bloomed with impossible flowers. Artists and scientists worked together on projects that would have been unimaginable weeks ago. Enemies had become neighbors, refugees had become contributors, and hope had replaced despair. And all of this would be destroyed in the process. Not necessarily, Zarathi said. The hegemony isn't insane. Faced with the united power of the convergence, they might choose to negotiate rather than fight. And if they don't? Silence filled the room. Finally, Valdris spoke. Then we fight the war that's been brewing for centuries and we see what survives. Marcus thought about his wife, who had died in the early days of the colony when medicine was scarce and help was far away. She'd told him on her deathbed that the hardest choices were usually between two things you couldn't bear to lose. There's a third option, he said finally. Marcus, Shadow warned, don't even think about it. The right of challenge. One-on-one combat between the hegemony's champion and the sanctuary keeper. Winner takes all. You can't fight High Marshal Crade, Rodriguez protested. He's killed hundreds of champions. He's not even fully biological anymore. Maybe not, Marcus agreed. But if I lose, only one person dies instead of billions. And if I win, the hegemony is bound by ancient law to respect the sanctuary's independence, Zarathi finished. Forever. It's suicide, Valdris said flatly. It's the only choice that doesn't risk destroying everything we've built here. Marcus turned back to the assembled delegates. I'll make you a deal. I'll invoke the right of challenge. If Crade accepts, you let me fight him alone. If he refuses, or if he somehow cheats, then you have my blessing to activate the convergence and turn this system into the galaxy's biggest battlefield. The room erupted in protests from a dozen different species, but Marcus held up his hand. This is my sanctuary, he said quietly. My responsibility. And my choice. Outside his window, 2 refugee children from species that had been enemies for millennia shared a toy that glowed with gentle light. It was exactly the kind of moment his wife would have loved to see. When do we send the challenge? Prime Counselor Zarathi's starlight form dimmed slightly. The formal protocols require a face-to-face declaration. High Marshal Crade arrives with the Hegemony fleet in 10 days. Then I guess I have 10 days. To figure out how to fight a nearly immortal warrior who's never lost a battle. Marcus, Valdris said, standing and placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not going to face him alone. Sanctuary law or not, I won't let you die for my mistakes. Marcus smiled, feeling the warmth of her touch and the determination in her voice. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Think you can teach an old colonist how to fight like a dragon? Fire danced in her eyes. I can try. But Marcus, even with everything I can teach you, Crade has advantages we can't match. Maybe, Marcus said, looking out at the impossible garden that had grown from simple kindness. But I've got something he doesn't. What's that? Something worth fighting for. The Hegemony fleet arrived exactly on schedule, a dark stain against the stars that blotted out entire constellations. Hundreds of warships in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting no light, their weapons arrays visible even from the planet's surface. At their center sat a command dreadnought that dwarfed everything else in the system. Marcus stood in the field that had once been his simple front yard, now transformed into an arena that sparkled with crystalline formations and floating lights. Representatives from across the galaxy had gathered to witness what many believed would be the shortest formal challenge in recorded history. You know, Marcus said to Valdris, who stood beside him in her dragon form for the first time in public. 10 days ago, I thought learning to channel fire through my hands was the hardest thing I'd ever do. Her massive head turned toward him, golden eyes reflecting both flame and worry. You've learned more in 10 days than most students master in years. But Marcus, Crade isn't just a warrior. He's a force of destruction made manifest. So I've heard. The transport that descended from the dreadnought was as black as the ships that bore it, its hull inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. When the airlock opened, High Marshal Crade stepped out, and Marcus understood why the galaxy feared him. He stood 3 meters tall, his 4 arms ending in hands that could have crushed a human skull like an egg. His skin looked like living metal, scarred by weapons that would have vaporized lesser beings. The personal shield that surrounded him distorted the air itself, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who had conquered worlds for sport. Marcus Chen, Crade's voice carried across the field without amplification, resonating with harmonics that spoke of absolute authority. You are the human who claims the right of challenge? I am. Marcus stepped forward, very aware of how small he looked next to the towering figure. You are High Marshal Crade of the Hegemony forces? I am destruction incarnate. I am the end of hope for those who oppose the Hegemony's will. I have killed champions from 1,000 worlds. Crade's 4 eyes fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity. Why do you wish to die, little human? I don't, Marcus replied calmly. I wish to protect what matters. Do you accept the terms of formal challenge? I accept, Crade said, and the words carried the weight of ancient law. Single combat, no quarter given or asked. The winner's cause is upheld by all laws written and unwritten. The arena fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the 2 combatants took their positions. Around the perimeter, beings from across the galaxy watched with the attention usually reserved for historical moments. You may begin when ready, announced Prime Counselor Zarathi, her starlight form serving as the only referee this contest would have. Crade moved faster than anything his size had a right to, 4 arms blurring as he drew weapons that materialized from his personal arsenal. Energy blasts that could level buildings streaked toward Marcus, who rolled aside and felt the heat wash over him. But Marcus had learned more than just combat techniques in the past 10 days. He'd learned to draw on the Sanctuary's power, to channel the collective will of everyone who had found safety here. As Crade's weapons fire scorched the ground where he'd been standing, Marcus reached out with senses Valdris had taught him to use. He felt the crystal being's song of light, the refugees' dreams of home, the children's laughter echoing across dimensions he'd never known existed. Power flowed through him, not his own but freely given, and suddenly the impossible didn't seem quite so impossible. Marcus raised his hand, and fire answered his call. Not the simple flames Valdris had first taught him to summon, but something deeper, older, the fire of stars being born, of hope refusing to die, of kindness multiplied across the cosmos. Crade's energy blasts met Marcus's fire, and annihilated each other in explosions that shook the ground. The High Marshal's expression shifted from contempt to surprise to something approaching respect. "Interesting," Kraid said, holstering two of his weapons. "You have been taught well. But tricks of light and heat will not save you." The towering warrior charged, moving with the momentum of a falling mountain. Marcus stood his ground until the last possible second, then stepped aside and struck with techniques Shadow had shown him, targeting pressure points that existed even in heavily modified anatomy. His blow connected, and for the first time in living memory, High Marshal Kraid staggered. The watching crowd erupted in sounds that ranged from cheers to harmonic vibrations to bioluminescent displays of excitement. But Marcus kept his attention focused on his opponent, who was looking at him with new eyes. "You fight like no human I have encountered," Kraid said, rolling his shoulders to test for damage. "Tell me, Sanctuary Keeper, what drives you to such impossible courage?" "Look around you," Marcus replied, breathing hard but still standing. "Every person here was lost, hurt, or running from something. I gave them a place to rest, and they made it into something beautiful. That's worth fighting for." "Beauty," Kraid repeated the word like it was foreign to him. I had forgotten that some still value such things. The High Marshal attacked again, but this time his movements were different. Still deadly, still precise, but no longer holding back. He fought like someone who had decided his opponent deserved his full attention. The battle that followed would be remembered in galactic histories for millennia. Marcus, drawing on power gifted freely by those who had found sanctuary, matched move for move with the hegemony's greatest champion. Fire met force, speed matched strength, and ancient techniques clashed with modern warfare. But Marcus was still human, still mortal, and the strain was taking its toll. His movements began to slow, his fire burned less brightly, and Kraid's superior size and strength began to tell. A blow from one of Kraid's massive hands sent Marcus sprawling, his borrowed power flickering like a candle in a storm. The High Marshal advanced, raising all four arms for a finishing strike. "You fought with honor, human. That is more than most achieve." Marcus looked up at the towering figure, then beyond him to the faces watching from around the arena. Refugees who had found hope. Children who had learned that different species could be friends. Scientists and artists who had discovered that sharing knowledge made everyone stronger. "I'm not fighting for honor," Marcus said, struggling to his feet one more time. "I'm fighting for home." Something changed in that moment. The power he'd been borrowing suddenly became his own, not taken but given, not channeled but shared. Every act of kindness he'd ever performed, every stranger he'd helped, every moment of compassion over 40 years of frontier life, all of it crystallized into something that was purely, uniquely human. Light erupted from Marcus. Not fire this time, but something gentler and infinitely more powerful. The light of sanctuary itself. The promise that there were still places where kindness mattered more than strength. Kraid's weapons simply stopped functioning. His personal shields flickered and died. His scarred skin began to show the weight of centuries of warfare, and for the first time since his transformation into a living weapon, he looked tired. "What have you done?" the High Marshal whispered. "Nothing," Marcus replied, the light fading as he stood, unmarked by the battle. "I just reminded the universe what sanctuary really means. It's not about being protected by laws or treaties or weapons. It's about being in a place where someone cares enough to help. No questions asked." Kraid stood silent for a long moment, looking at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. When he spoke, his voice carried tones that hadn't been there before. "I remember now. Before the wars, before the conquests, I had a garden. Small flowers that bloomed for only a single day each year. You could have a garden again," Marcus said quietly. "Sanctuary is open to everyone who comes in peace." The silence stretched across the arena and up to the fleets waiting in orbit. Finally, High Marshal Kraid knelt on one knee before the human who had reminded him what he'd lost. "The hegemony yields the challenge," he said formally. "The sanctuary is recognized and protected under all laws, ancient and modern." The celebration that followed shook the planet's crust and lit up sensor arrays across half the galaxy. But Marcus barely noticed. He was too busy watching High Marshal Kraid kneel beside a small plot of earth, carefully planting seeds with hands that had once destroyed worlds. "Not bad for a day's work," Valdra said, resuming her human form and slipping her arm through his. "Not bad at all," Marcus agreed, looking out over his transformed property where beings from across the galaxy worked together to build something unprecedented. Think we'll get any more strays? Shadow padded over, his tail wagging in a way that had nothing to do with his wolf form. Marcus, half the galaxy is already requesting permission to establish missions here. You're about to become the busiest sanctuary keeper in recorded history. Marcus Chen, former mining engineer and collector of strays, looked out over the impossible garden that had grown from simple kindness and smiled. His wife would have loved to see this. A place where anyone could find home, where different didn't mean enemy, where the simple act of caring could change the course of galactic history. Better get more coffee then, he said. Something tells me we're going to need it. In the distance, ships from 100 worlds descended through atmosphere, carrying refugees, diplomats, scientists, artists, and dreamers. All of them drawn to a small world where a man had chosen to help strangers, and in doing so, had reminded the universe what it meant to be human. The sanctuary was just beginning.